Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do another entry here. I haven't touched this series now in about a month or so. In fact, going forward, I'm going to go ahead and post at least one monthly entry here on this playlist. Number one, because there's still a lot of fascinating information to share here with regards to all these mafioso, the lesser known ones that I love showcasing on this channel. And number two, because they get a lot of views. There's definitely been a good amount of interest associated with my videos. They're definitely picking up a lot of steam, so always happy to share more information on here. Who knows, I might make this even more of a regular set of entries going forward. But in this case, it has to do with yet another lesser known person within the mafia world. He doesn't necessarily have a nickname like something like in the past videos. You know how these mafia members always love to have those nicknames, but his name definitely stood out. When I saw this random entry there on that website, I knew I just had to talk about him here. This is his name. His name is Rocco Racco. That's right. First name is Rocco. Last name is Racco. You're never going to forget a name like that, right? So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the information associated with this Rocco Racco, and then talk about it's actually one of the first times actually that I'm mentioning it here. He was someone that was executed within the penal system. So more on that here in a minute. So who was this Rocco Racco? Well, he was someone whose earlier days still remain a little bit of mystery. Like there's a lot of lesser known information as far as his youth and how he grew up and so on. What is known is that he was born in Italy back in 1868, and not exactly like a time period that we can name like in terms of a month or a year or a specific day, but at least 1868 seems to be the most common ground. And he was born at a location called Groteria, Italy. So again, Groteria, Italy, back in 1868. So he was born there to some parents named Giuseppe and Maria Racco. For all intents and purposes, they lived there for a couple of years. Cut to his somewhat in his youth in 1899. That's when he moved away along with the family. They settled over here in the United States, specifically in some areas there in New York, and then later on in Pennsylvania. In fact, this was because they had some relatives that were living upstate in New York at that time, and then that's how they were able to come over and then travel to other places like Albany, and then of course later on where he made most of his impact there in Pennsylvania. I always marvel at the amazing courage that people had back then to move, let's say, from one country to another back in the 1800s. Because imagine doing that today, but as hard as it is today, but imagine doing that back then with regards to very little information as to what's going to be there when you arrive, the people that are going to be there, how you're going to get a job, where you're going to live, and so on. Can you imagine something like that happening back then? Well, that's how they were doing it, and this guy and his family were able to at least set up a community of sorts there. In fact, eventually they found themselves in Hillsville, Pennsylvania. There was a strong mining community that was listed there, and a lot of Italian immigrants apparently went there to serve or work under the steel mills, a lot of the mills that were associated there. And in fact, that's how Rocco initially started. He started working there first as a miner, and then afterward, I think he had enough money finally to be able to work at a store. In fact, he was helping open a store known as the Peanut Quarry there. And then during his earlier days, still doing things, I guess, in the non-criminal lifestyle. He also worked at an insurance company, but then things turned. Somewhere around that region, that's when he finally fell into working into the lower criminal side, and then that's where he grew up in the criminal racket. In fact, reading about that region, it seems like there was a strong presence there of the Black Hand. You've heard me mention that before, right? When it comes to some of my past videos, the Black Hand. And the way I was reading this info, he was someone that it kind of was a little vague. Either he purposely went into the Black Hand, or if you're working in that region, eventually you're going to have your hands corrupted by working with the Black Hand. In other words, they force people to work for them, either through extortion or the type of means to get you into their society, if you could call it that. And then that's how eventually he started in that program. So flip the coin. It's up in the air as to how he purposely did it or was coerced into it. But either way, he seemed to do very, very well, because he eventually became a leader of one of the local societies there. and he in turn was targeting other new victims. In fact, he was able to extort a lot of the Italian immigrants, the ones that were coming over in droves over to that location, telling them that they would have to pay a certain amount of racket in order to do so, a certain amount of fees in order to have a safety net around them. Of course, the only thing keeping things safe is everyone else. Like this guy Rocco, and then also the Black Hand. They were the ones creating the danger, but they were the ones claiming that they were trying to save people from other danger outright. And of course, if you didn't pay, then that's when things got a little bit worse and worse for you. In some cases, even involving death altogether. But yeah, that's how he operated for a good while, a couple of years there in the Black Hand Society. What's interesting, though, is that this guy Rocco actually almost came not to blows, but came on bad terms with that society, because as it turns out, apparently he slept with another society member's wife, something that is considered an offense punishable by death. And when this happened, some of the Black Hand leaders there got together in New York City, and then they decided to pass judgment on him, because by that point he had become the boss of that location there in Hillsville. They stated that he would not have the death penalty, their version of the death penalty, placed upon him because of him sleeping with someone else's wife, but he would have to be removed from his post, from his leadership post. And so because of that, that's when he was gone. Cut to something else, though, another faction, another item happening very soon that would also spell doom for Rocco. So as it turns out, in that location, there was a popular area where men could go to and do hunting, either hunting or fishing. The only thing was that area there was monitored by a state game warden called Sealy Hook. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Sealy Hook. And the way it stated was he was someone there that was strictly enforcing all the laws associated with hunting and fishing. You could definitely do so under certain terms and conditions. Anyone else going outside of that, then that's when they had to face this state game warden. Now here's where things get a little bit confusing. In one area, I was reading that on that fateful day, Rocco was there with someone else, in this case, a guy by the name of Luigi Ritordo, and then they were there hunting. They came across this guy Hook, this game warden Hook, and when that happened, that's when there was a fight, and then things escalated, and the state game warden Sealy Hook got shot and killed. That's one version. The other version is that Rocco was not there. In fact, only this guy, Luigi Ritordo, who's someone that worked in one of Rocco's stores, he was there by himself, and he had his dog with him, Rocco's dog with him, named Paolo. And then what happened was the state game warden Sealy Hook came upon Luigi, and when that happened, that's when the dog almost tried to attack, in this case, that guy, the state game warden Sealy Hook. And when that occurred, the state game warden shot the dog Paolo, and then that's when Rocco later vowed vengeance, because Luigi was able to escape, but obviously Rocco's dog was killed, and that would cause him a lot of grief and frustration and eventually anger, and that's when he swore vengeance against him. And yet, if you want yet another different version, it's this, is that they came across, like in this case, Luigi and Rocco were there hunting in that area, and then the state game warden, Sealy Hook, came across them, and he was almost like going to let them go, but as a warning, he in turn purposely shot the dog Paolo, like in other words, like in a malicious, evil, sinister manner, like he wanted to shoot the dog in order to set an example. I'm guessing that in this version it was because there were so many people breaking rules as far as the fishing and hunting laws that eventually something had to be done according to him, almost like an example of sorts. So that's yet another version. So just like I mentioned earlier, flip a coin, take your pick when it comes to which version is correct. Either way, though, what happened afterward is one version, and that's this. The guy, the state game warden Sealy Hook, ended up disappearing. In fact, he disappeared for quite a while, almost a month or so. No one was able to see him. No one knew what happened to him. Finally, people started to look around his area, look around where he worked, some of the areas there involving the muddy banks, and then that's when they found him. They found him near a location by the Mahoning River, and then that's where his body was found. There had been a shot in the chest, and then also a was shot to his face, basically blowing away the lower portion of his face. So clearly he had been murdered, and now it was up to the people there and the task of the police to find out what happened, who caused this murder. Now, some people immediately started singling out Rocco himself because, again, by that point, I don't know if he was still within the leadership of a Black Hand Society, but he was still a prominent figure there, at least on the bad side. Like, he was still extorting people. He was still causing people lots of grief, especially a lot of the Italian immigrants there. Ironic, again, considering that it was only a couple of years back that he himself was an Italian immigrant. And so some of the private citizens there, I guess they were trying to make sure that he was held culpable, like they knew he did it, or they wanted to find evidence associated with him doing it. They pulled their resources together. They hired a detective agency called the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and then within there was a detective, a guy by the name of Francis P. Demois, and he was someone that was considered very, very prominent, very skilled in his task. Like, he was someone that could get the answer no matter what. And so eventually he went undercover there in Hillsville, Pennsylvania, and eventually he was able to gather information that stated that people were pointing it to Rocco Racco. Like, he was the one that was the suspect in the murder of the state game warden. And as it turns out, Rocco Racco was actually already in jail. Apparently he had been sent to jail because he was convicted of stealing some money from other people. And so there he was, the detective going to the jail, trying to find more information on him. And as it turns out, another inmate there was also someone who gained privy information associated with Rocco Racco being the one to pull the trigger. And so the detective went there, and according to some versions, and again, things kind of differentiate here or there, but by the time the detective reached the prison to interview that inmate, a guy by the name of Candido, that's when Candido was kind of, I guess, a little bit scared at that point because other inmates who were associated with the mafia were making him kind of quiet. But in any case, this detective, DeMio, was able to finally get the confession associated from that guy Candido. And when that happened, not only that, but other inmates started to turn on Rocco Racco. Even some of the mafia people that were originally threatening Candido to stay quiet, they also turned on Racco and they confessed that, yes, this was the guy that murdered that state game warden. Eventually, it pointed evidence to his wife as well, as far as hiding things, especially the shotgun that was used in the murder. So they went to the home, they found the shotgun, they presented it to Rocco, and he confessed. It was interesting to read that too. He finally confessed, he outright confessed and stated that, yep, that was him, that was his gun, and then he was sentenced to death at that point. In fact, I was reading some of this information too, how close he came to actually escaping. Not escaping like from the jail, but escaping in the sense that he was set on bail, because as it turns out, he was able to get some of his friends to front up $2,000, which must have been a bunch of money back then in the early 1900s, $2,000 to be able to go get him out on bail, and then he fled. Like, he absolutely fled the minute that happened. It's like, no duh, right? How would somebody like that be able to get bail, especially with so much of criminal ties associated to him? But eventually police were able to capture him in New York. They brought him back, and then that's when, again, the formal sentencing was still going forward as far as the murder and of that state game warden. And so as it turns out, finally, after all this time, and then after, again, the waiting, there was even at one point appeals, not to mention that, but a stay of execution by the governor of that state as well. But finally, on the execution date of October 26, 1909, that's when Rocco Racco was finally put to death. And this was formally for the death of that state game warden. The gun was linked to him. Eyewitnesses were linked to him. I think that guy, though, that was there with the dog, the store clerk, if I read correctly, I think he actually escaped. Like, he fled over to Italy, and I don't have his information as to what happened to him afterwards. But in any case, Rocco stated that on his execution date, he would make a statement. He would find it like he was quiet about everything else. As part of the mafia, like, he was someone that was not saying anything to the authorities at all, as far as what had happened from before. And so people were expecting on that fateful morning that finally he was going to either do something, confess, implicate others, stuff like that. And so as it turns out, at 10 o'clock that morning, on October 26, this was his statement. Right before the noose was placed around his neck and right before the the drawbridge was essentially removed to snap his neck afterward. He said, "Gentlemen, I did not see Sealy Hook killed. I did not see anyone kill him, and I have no suspicion of any person. I pardon everybody and expect to go to Jesus right now. Goodbye." Those were his last words. Can you believe it? His last words. He didn't confess, nor did he implicate anyone else, nor did he say anything that would bring any more information. Whatever he had, it basically took to his death, and then that's when the switch was pulled, and then that was it. He was killed. And so this is, again, one of the few times, the only time I can remember on my playlist, where we have somebody like a mafioso that I'm talking about here actually executed, actually killed right there in prison. Because I mentioned about others dying in prison, but it's usually from bad health or natural causes or other being released and then being killed like out on the street, gangster style. But I know this is the first time that I can recall that somebody was actually killed there in prison by the government, essentially. But that's pretty much it. That's all the information associated with this guy, Rocco Racco. How about that? Very memorable name, no? Someone that was, again, there early on in the United States, already working with the Black Hand Society, either on purpose or brought in by them forcefully, and then working his way up and then committing all these atrocities, and then finally having that fateful day, an encounter, either him later at there in person or later on with that game state warden, Mr. Sealy Hook, and then that eventually caused him to meet his demise afterward. But if anybody has any more information, anything else might have missed, please post those comments below as always. And let me know too if you want me to continue these videos on a more consistent basis. I'd love to be able to hear what your thoughts are on there too. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.